Welcome back to Women Writers in Chinese History. This video introduces one of the most famous female figures in the Chinese tradition, Wang Zhaojun. Wang Zhaojun lived during the Western Han Dynasty during the 1st century BCE. She was known to have been married to what's now the Inner Mongolian area to the Khan of Xiongnu, then a rivaling force to the Han Dynasty. Her marriage was meant to form a political alliance to bring peace to the borders. In the Chinese tradition, Wang Zhaojun's story has been popularly known as Zhaojun Chusai, Zhaojun leaving the pass, that is the path between Han China and the outside world to the north. The red arrow on the map on the left shows Zhaojun's travel from the Han capital Chang'an to the land of Xiongnu in today's Inner Mongolia. To understand Wang Zhaojun's story, let's first introduce the tradition of political marriage alliances in China, a practice known as heqin. Throughout traditional Chinese history, marriage alliances took place from time to time, usually upon the initiative of foreign rulers. That is, they would send messengers to the Chinese court to seek out a princess or a young woman from a noble family as the king's bride. The Chinese court was supposed to grant these requests, since rejecting them might trigger military troubles at the borders. In Chinese history, marriage alliances were the most frequent during the Han Dynasty and the later Tang Dynasty, which were actively expanding their influences outward. Through cultural memories about these marriage alliances, we may witness certain patterns in traditional perceptions about the Chinese dynasty's relation to the outside world. To begin with, you might have heard of the term Sino-centrism. That is, simply put, a worldview according to which the Chinese system is the best of all civilizations, and the Chinese emperor, as the Son of Heaven, possesses a universal authority to command respect and even to claim a ritually superior position across the entire known world. Of course, for the most part, these sinocentric assumptions, especially regarding the Chinese emperor's universal authority, were merely a myth being upheld at the imperial court, and Chinese dynasties were often facing real-world military pressures, especially from its northern and western borders. The imperative to grant foreign rulers' requests for Chinese brides emerged under these military pressures. From a Sinocentric cultural perspective, the Chinese brides in these marriage alliances not only traveled far away from home, but also away from the land of civilization. Their images are thus as tragic as those abandoned palace women. And, as in the case of abandoned palace women like concubine Ban, we can find a number of poems written in the voice of those young women married to foreign lands. And once again, various evidences suggest that they were more likely written by male authors of later generations. Poems in the voice of those women express not only the sentimental, tragic emotions, but also a strong attachment to the land of China and the Chinese civilization. In this manner, they signal their actual authors' national and ethnic identification. During the Han period, marriage alliances were usually made with Xiongnu, a nomadic people whose traditional territory included Mongolia, Western Manchuria, and Central Asian regions. You may still remember the case of the woman writer Ban Zhao's brother Ban Chao, who was the leading Han general on the borders adjacent to the Xiongnu territory for decades. In the Chinese language, the character Hu emerged as a general term to refer to various nomadic peoples outside the borders of the Han Dynasty, such as Xiongnu, vis-a-vis the Han people, the Chinese populace within the Han territory. Of course, Han nowadays serves as the name for the main ethnicity in China. Roughly, the Han population constitutes over 95% of the Chinese population, and the rest of the population consists of 55 ethnic minorities according to official designation by the Chinese government. Back to the Han Dynasty. Before Wang Zhaojun, a princess who was married to the land of Hu, in particular a Central Asian kingdom called Wusun, was Liu Xijun. We have a poem attributed to her, although the authenticity of the attribution is questionable. This poem, under the theme Lament, 悲愁, may exemplify the typical theme of other poems written in the voice of princesses married afar. Here is the full poem. My family sent me off in marriage to the end of the world, far away to a strange country, to the king of Wusun. A yurt is now my home, its walls made of felt. Raw meat is my food here, and kumis my drink. All day my heart aches with pains of home. Were only I a brown goose and could fly home. 吾家嫁我兮天一方，远托异国兮乌孙王。穷庐为室兮瞻为墙，以肉为食兮烙为浆。居长土司兮心内伤，愿为黄鹄兮归故乡。The brown goose, Huanghu, that appears at the end of the song is a common image in Chinese poetry to express a wish to take wings and return home. The hu here should be a type of swan-like wild goose, and the same type of bird is more frequently called a hong or yan in Chinese poetry. As to Wang Zhaojun, she is much better known than Liu Xijun. In fact, today she is often listed as one of the four great beauties of traditional China, 中国古代四大美女. The other three beauties are Xi Shi, Diao and consort Yang, Yang Guifei. Xi Shi supposedly lived during the 5th century BCE during the spring and autumn period. Amidst the military struggles between the kingdom of Wu and the kingdom of Yue, she was sent to the king of Wu as a concubine and acted as a spy on behalf of Yue, thus helping her home country to eventually conquer the kingdom of Wu. Diao from the Three Kingdoms period after the fall of the Han Dynasty served a very similar role, this time as the concubine of a powerful yet evil minister, in order to carry out a secret plan to bring him down. Traditionally, cases such as Xi Shi and Diao are referred to as the beauty scheme, 美人计, in which women were sent out as secret agents to seduce and influence political figures in the enemy force. Consort Yang, on the other hand, is another famous femme fatale in Chinese history. Supposedly, Emperor Xuanzong of Tang's infatuation of her led to the devastating Anlushan rebellion during the 8th century, following which the Tang dynasty declined significantly. We have discussed those earlier instances of femme fatale in Mandate of Heaven stories as a form of scapegoating, and the case of Consort Yang is very similar to those previous cases. As we can see, the four beauties were all women deeply involved in political struggles and were more or less tragic figures. Among them, Diao is very likely fictional, mostly known through the novel Romance of Three Kingdoms. In the case of the other three women, facts mixed with fiction in historical records about them, and their stories were frequently reinvented in later literary works. Yet, it's interesting to note that among those famous beauties, Wang Zhaojun is likely the one who has received the most literary treatments, especially in poetry. Let's take a look at her story first, and then ponder on the strong literary interests in her image in traditional China. First of all, records about Wang Zhaojun are quite brief in the History of Han, which was compiled closer to her lifetime. There, it simply mentioned that she was a palace woman coming from a good family at the court of Emperor Yuan and was later married to the Khan. In her case, she had entered the imperial palace, but likely didn't get to have a relationship with the emperor, and possibly had never met him in person. Therefore, she was eligible for forming the marriage alliance. In the history of latter Han, Hou Han Shu, which was compiled in the early 5th century during the southern dynasties, that is centuries after Wang Zhaojun's lifetime, we found more details on her beauty and personality. And it's indicated there she possibly volunteered since she's not receiving any favors in the imperial palace. The best-known version of Wang Zhaojun's story, however, came from an unofficial source called Various Notes on the Western Capital, Xijin Zaji. This is a book of anecdotal and sometimes fantastic stories. The book has been attributed to the Han Dynasty, but many stories included there possibly came from later Southern Dynasties period. In contrast to the brief notes in official histories, Wang Zhaojun's story in Various Notes on the Western Capital is full of vivid details and dramatic twists. Let's take a look at it together. The inner palace of Emperor Yuan was well stocked with women. Because he could not visit them all on a regular basis, he had their portraits painted, and on the basis of these, would summon them to share his couch. The palace ladies paid huge bribes to the painters, sometimes as much as 100,000 copper coins, but no less than 50,000 copper coins per person. Wang Zhaojun was the only one to refuse to do so, and as a result was never summoned by the emperor. When the Xiongnu appeared at court, he requested a beauty to be his spouse. The emperor then decided, basing himself on those paintings, to have Zhaojun go. But when he received her in audience, on the occasion of her departure, she turned out not only to be the most beautiful of all the palace ladies, but also quick-witted in conversation and elegant in appearance. Later, the emperor had the matter thoroughly investigated, after which the painters were all executed and their fortunes, which amounted to millions, were confiscated. Among these painters was Mao Yanshou from Duling. When he painted people, he always succeeded in capturing their likeness, whether beautiful or ugly, young or old. Given Wang Zhaojun's refusal to bribe the palace painters, as reported in this widely known story, her image would be morally appealing to male scholars who took pride in their own virtues and refused to phone the powerful against their principles. In other words, other than being a tragic female figure, Wang Zhaojun also embodies the principle of moral integrity valorized in Confucianism. Of course, Wang Zhaojun's story is evocative of many other themes as well. As an indication of the rich connotations of her image, over 1,000 poems about her from the traditional period are still extant. Moreover, we do have at least one poem ascribed to her and again entitled Resentment, 怨词. Resentment or Lament, 怨, is the same title given to Concubine Ban's poem on the abandoned fan, and to many other poems written in the voice of a tragic female figure. The book that includes this poem has been attributed to the 2nd century, but more likely it was compiled during the 5th century. This is a tetrasyllabic poem, in other words, a poem with 4 characters per line. The central image is a bird that represents the story of Wang Zhaojun, beautiful but unappreciated in the palace chambers, eventually soaring away to change her fate, yet feeling forlorn for having been separated from her home and her king. Although the poem ends on a note of sadness and despair, it does represent a certain agency on the part of the bird, or Wang Zhaojun, for flying away from a life of obscurity and loneliness in the inner palace. How lush and lovely those autumn trees! Their leaves turn brown and yellow, and on that hill there's a bird that roosts in a mulberry tree. How she grooms her plumes and feathers! How brilliant are her form and features! She soars up high into the clouds and freely roams in hidden chambers. 秋木萋萋，其叶萎黄。有鸟处山，集于巴桑。养育毛羽，形容生光。既得行云，上游曲房。But how's the part I'm not used? My body is shattered and hidden away. All my hopes have now been dashed. Never will we fly together wing to wing. Even though I do not lack for food, yet still my heart is sad and troubled. All alone, what shall I do? Let me go and change my lot. 离宫绝旷，身体摧残。意念莫尘，不得斜行。虽得委群，心有回黄。我独伊河，来往变长。The swallow flitting here and there has come to roost with the western Qiang. The mountains there are high and steep. The rivers there flow wide and full. O my father, O my mother, long and distant is the road. Alas, oh alas, I cry, oh alas. Sorrow's pain so wounds my heart. 翩翩之雁，远及西羌。高山峨峨，河水泱泱。父兮母兮，尽足且长。呜呼哀哉，忧心侧伤。Other than poems, Wang Zhaojun's story was also featured in traditional dramas and fictions, especially after these genres became more popular and mature during the later imperial dynasties. As stated in Red Brush, changes of Zhaojun's image were related to cultural imaginations about women, the outside world, and the formation of nationalist sentiments. Drama and fiction are especially indicative of those ideological trends. Notably, nationalist sentiments became more prominent in Song China, roughly between the 10th and 13th centuries, during a period when the Han Chinese dynasties was constantly under the threat of military invasions from dynasties established by other ethnicities on its northern and western borders. In 1127, northern China was taken over by the Zhechen Jin dynasty. In 1279, the remaining Song territory in the south was conquered by the Mongols, who subsequently established the Yuan dynasty in Chinese history. The Mongol rulers implemented an ethnic hierarchy that placed the Han Chinese from southern Song at the bottom and suspended the civil examination for a long period of time. Having lost their social privileges and being ethnically discriminated against, Han Chinese male scholars channeled their nationalist sentiments into literary creation. Wang Zhaojun's image also transformed during this process, such as in a famous play entitled Autumn in the Han Palace, Han Gongqiu, which was written by Ma Zhiyuan during the Yuan dynasty. This play portrays a deep romantic love between the emperor and Wang Zhaojun. In the play, the painter Mao Yanshou was the villain and the traitor who defected to the Xiongnu force and persuaded the Khan to ask for Zhaojun as his bride. Under the pressures of military threats, the emperor had to agree to the request. Then, as the climax of the play, on her way to become the Khan's bride, Zhaojun commits suicide by drowning in a river at the border to demonstrate her undying love for the emperor and for her home country. In today's China, Wang Zhaojun's story has a very different implication for ethnic relations. The Chinese government has been emphasizing on ethnic harmony between the Han Chinese and 55 ethnic minorities, which include the Chinese Mongolians, many of whom live in today's Inner Mongolia. In this context, Wang Zhaojun's image has also been reinvented as an ambassador of sort, who contributed to multi-ethnic exchange and alliance in Chinese history. Today, in the capital city of Inner Mongolia, Hohhot, Huhehaote, you can visit Wang Zhaojun's tomb, which has been called the Evergreen Tomb Qingzhong, since the grasses on the burial site supposed to remain green throughout the year, as a symbol of Zhaojun's virtue. At the end of this presentation on Wang Zhaojun, let's further ponder on a music instrument she's always associated with, the pipa. In depictions of Wang Zhaojun, she's almost always holding a pipa, an instrument that expresses her artistic cultivation and longings for home. Here we can see some traditional examples. And here are some images from the modern period. Pipa was a traditional Chinese instrument, but it was of Central Asian origins. It was imported into China since an early period and became popular in China since the Han Dynasty. And also notably, pipa was usually played by female entertainers during the traditional period. Here we can see past and present images of women performing the pipa, although today there are many male musicians of the pipa as well. Perhaps Zhaojun's strong association with pipa had to do with both the multi-ethnic background of the instrument and the feminine tradition underlying its performance history. The story of Zhaojun leaving the past also became one of the most famous pipa music pieces. Here, let's listen to a performance of this song as we conclude the presentation. Again, please remember to complete the quiz and watch the next video, which is the last for this lecture set. I hope you'll enjoy the music.